In 1847, on the sprawling Whitmore plantation in southern Louisiana, something unnatural was happening, something that would shatter lives like glass beneath a hammer. Thomas Whitmore was a man who had everything: 3,000 acres of cotton fields, 200 slaves, a mansion with white columns that gleamed in the southern sun, and a wife whose family name opened every door in New Orleans. But Thomas Whitmore wanted more. He wanted Celeste. She was 24 years old, with skin the color of burnished copper and eyes that held secrets she'd never speak aloud. Thomas had bought her 5 years ago at a Charleston auction, and from the moment he saw her, something dark took root in his chest, something he convinced himself was love, though it was truly obsession wrapped in the filthy cloth of power. His wife, Margaret, was everything society demanded: pale as porcelain, educated in Paris, descended from old plantation wealth that predated the Louisiana Purchase. But Margaret was cold, her affection measured in social advantages and dinner party performances. Their marriage was a business arrangement between families, consummated out of duty and maintained through separate bedrooms and polite indifference. Thomas told himself this justified what came next. He began giving Celeste privileges that made the other house slaves whisper and the field slaves stare. She no longer scrubbed floors. Instead, she arranged flowers and read books from his personal library. She wore dresses of fine cotton, not the rough canvas given to others. She took her meals after the family, but before the other slaves, eating food from the main kitchen on real plates. Thomas would summon her to his study in the evenings, dismissing the other servants, and they would talk, or rather, he would talk while she performed the most exhausting labor of all, pretending to care, nodding at the right moments, smiling when his hand lingered too long on hers. She learned to read his moods like weather patterns, knowing when a storm was coming, when to laugh at his jokes, when to touch his arm gently, when to lower her eyes in practiced modesty. Every gesture was survival. Every word was a calculation, because Celeste understood what Thomas refused to see. She wasn't his companion, she was his property, and the kindness of a master is still the cruelty of chains. The other slaves knew it too. They saw how Thomas looked at her, how his eyes followed her across rooms, how his voice softened when he spoke her name. Some pitied her, others resented her. All of them understood she was navigating a knife's edge, where one wrong step meant either the auction block or something worse. But Margaret saw everything. She watched from upper windows as Thomas walked toward the slave quarters at twilight. She noticed when her best silver went missing, only to reappear in Celeste's small cabin. She counted the minutes her husband spent locked in his study with that woman, hearing their muffled voices through the walls. Margaret's fury was a cold thing, patient and calculating, sharpened over months of humiliation into something that could cut through bone. She'd been raised to maintain appearances, to never show emotion in public, to smile through every indignity society heaped upon wives of powerful men. But this was beyond endurance. Her husband wasn't just keeping a slave mistress. He was parading his obsession before God and everyone, eroding her dignity one privilege at a time. The breaking point came on a suffocating August evening when Thomas gave Celeste something no slave should ever possess: a key. The key to the master bedroom. Margaret discovered it by accident, seeing the glint of brass as Celeste tucked it into her apron pocket. The symbolism was nauseating. He was giving this woman access to their most intimate space, replacing his lawful wife with property he'd purchased for $800. That night, Margaret didn't sleep. She sat at her writing desk, gas lamp flickering, as her mind turned over possibilities like cards in a dangerous game. By dawn, she'd made her decision. She pulled out her finest stationery and began to write, not to family, not to friends, but a letter whose recipient would surprise everyone. Her pen scratched across paper with the sound of a blade being sharpened, each word another step toward something irreversible. Margaret stood at the window 3 days later, watching her husband walk toward the slave quarters again, his step quick with anticipation, his hand clutching a small wrapped package, another gift for his beloved. In Margaret's hand, she clutched that letter, sealed with red wax that looked like a drop of blood. A letter that would change everything. A letter that would set in motion a chain of events ending in fire, death, and a freedom none of them could imagine. But she couldn't know that Celeste had written a letter too. Margaret stood at the window, watching her husband walk toward the slave quarters again. In her hand, she clutched a letter that would change everything. Margaret's letter had been addressed to Thomas's business partner in New Orleans, a man who handled the legal affairs of every prominent plantation family in Louisiana. She'd asked him to investigate her husband's finances, and what came back 3 weeks later confirmed her worst fears and gave her something more valuable than gold: leverage. Thomas wasn't just lavishing gifts on Celeste. He was preparing legal documents. Freedom papers, a land deed for 40 acres in Arkansas, a bank account in Celeste's name with enough money to live independently for years. He was planning to free her, to set her up as a free woman of color in a territory where such things were barely tolerated, where he could visit her away from the judgment of Louisiana society. Margaret read these documents in her husband's locked desk drawer, her hands trembling not with sadness but with volcanic rage. He was willing to give this slave woman what he'd never given his own wife: choice. But Margaret couldn't understand the truth that Celeste lived with every single day. In the small cabin behind the main house, Celeste sat on the edge of her rope bed, staring at the latest gift Thomas had brought, a cameo brooch that had belonged to his mother. He'd presented it with tears in his eyes, calling her his truest companion, his soul's mirror, believing every moment between them was genuine affection. When he finally left, Celeste had removed the brooch like it was a spider crawling on her skin and shoved it into a wooden box under her bed where she kept all his gifts, things she couldn't refuse without punishment, things that felt like shackles made of gold. The truth was this: Celeste didn't love Thomas Whitmore. How could she? Love requires freedom, requires choice, requires the ability to walk away. Every smile she gave him was a mask. Every gentle touch was a performance. Every soft word was the price of survival in a world where she owned nothing, not even her own body. She'd watched other slave women resist men like Thomas, watched them get sold away from their children, watched them whipped until their backs looked like plowed fields, watched one thrown into the swamp for fighting back against the overseer. Celeste had learned early that resistance came in quieter forms. She'd learned to make Thomas believe she was special, different from the others, that she welcomed his attention. It was the most exhausting performance of her life, and she gave it every single day, because the alternative was unthinkable. At night, alone in her cabin, she would scrub her skin until it was raw, trying to wash away the feeling of his hands, his breath, his words of devotion that felt like blasphemy against everything love should mean. She had dreams. Lord, did she have dreams? Dreams of the North, where she'd heard colored people could walk free, could own businesses, could read without fear, could say no and have it matter. Dreams of finding the mother she'd been sold away from when she was 9 years old. Dreams of a life where her body belonged to herself alone. But freedom papers from Thomas would be chains of a different kind. She'd be his woman in a different territory, still dependent on his money, still expected to welcome him into her bed, still trapped in the story he'd written where he was the benevolent hero and she was the grateful recipient of his magnanimous love. It would be slavery with better curtains. Thomas, meanwhile, told himself beautiful lies. He believed Celeste looked forward to his visits. He interpreted her careful management of his moods as genuine care for his well-being. He convinced himself that the system of slavery was wrong except in cases like theirs, where true affection transcended the boundaries of race and law. He saw himself as enlightened, as different from other masters, as a man capable of loving beyond society's restrictions. He was blind to the obvious truth. You cannot love someone you have the power to sell. The night everything changed was humid and thick with the promise of storms. Thomas had drunk too much whiskey at dinner, and when Margaret tried to discuss the cotton yields, he'd waved her away with contempt. You understand nothing of what I need, he'd snarled, his words slurred. You're cold as a January creek, always have been. You think marriage is about maintaining appearances, but I found something real, Margaret. Something you could never give me. Margaret's face had remained perfectly composed, but her knuckles went white around her wine glass. Something real? She'd repeated, her voice dangerous and quiet. You found property you're infatuated with, Thomas. There's nothing real about a woman who has no choice but to smile at you. Thomas had stood then, swaying slightly, and said the words that sealed all their fates. I'm taking Celeste to the governor's ball next month. I'm done hiding. Let them talk. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the slaves serving dinner had frozen, understanding they'd just witnessed something catastrophic. Thomas walked out, heading toward Celeste's cabin as he did every night. Margaret sat alone at the long dining table, surrounded by empty chairs and the ruins of her marriage. Then she stood, smoothed her skirts, and walked with perfect posture toward the slave quarters. Toward Celeste's cabin. That night, Margaret visited Celeste for the first time in 5 years. What she offered the slave girl wasn't freedom. It was something far more dangerous, revenge. That night, Margaret visited Celeste's cabin. What she offered the slave girl wasn't freedom. It was something far more dangerous, revenge. Celeste heard the knock and knew immediately it wasn't Thomas. His knock was proprietary, impatient, the knock of a man who believed he had the right to enter without waiting for an answer. This knock was sharp, controlled, deliberate. When she opened the door, Margaret Whitmore stood in the darkness like a pale ghost, her silk dressing gown gleaming in the moonlight, her face a mask of barely contained fury. We need to talk, Margaret said, and before Celeste could respond, she stepped inside the small cabin, her eyes scanning the space with visible disgust. The rope bed, the single wooden chair, the trunk containing everything Celeste owned in the world. Margaret's nose wrinkled at the smell of tallow candles and unwashed bodies from the quarters nearby, so different from the rose-scented luxury of the main house. For a long moment neither woman spoke. They existed on opposite sides of an unbridgeable chasm, one who owned everything, one who owned nothing, both trapped in the orbit of the same terrible man. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. He's going to free you, she said flatly, pulling the legal documents from beneath her shawl and dropping them on the small table like an accusation. 40 acres in Arkansas, $5,000 and your freedom papers. He's been planning this for months. Celeste's heart lurched, not with joy, but with terror. Freedom on Thomas's terms meant a different kind of cage, one where she'd be forever indebted, forever expected to play the role of grateful mistress, forever trapped in his delusion of love. She said nothing, her face carefully neutral, years of survival teaching her to reveal nothing until she understood the danger she faced. Margaret laughed bitterly. You don't even look happy. Good. That means you're not as stupid as he thinks you are. She moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. I know you don't love him, girl. I've watched you for 5 years. I see how you steel yourself before he arrives, how you scrub yourself raw afterward, how your smile never reaches your eyes. He's too blind with his own fantasy to notice, but I see everything. Celeste felt something crack inside her chest. The exhausting performance finally witnessed, finally named. But she kept her voice steady, careful. Why are you telling me this, ma'am? Margaret's eyes glittered dangerously. Because I want him destroyed. Not divorced, that would leave him his wealth and reputation. Not simply humiliated, he's too arrogant to care what people whisper. I want him ruined completely, legally, socially, financially. I want him to lose everything the way he's taken everything from me. She paused. Her next words carried the weight of something long buried. And I think you want the same thing, Celeste's mind raced. This was dangerous territory. More dangerous than anything she'd navigated before. One wrong word and Margaret could have her sold, beaten, killed. But something in the white woman's voice, something raw and desperate, made Celeste take a gamble. What are you proposing? She asked quietly. Margaret smiled, and it was a terrible thing to see. Thomas has been embezzling from his own business partners to fund your little freedom package. He's been falsifying ledgers, hiding assets, even selling property that doesn't belong solely to him. I have proof. If that information reaches the right people, his partners, the banks, the courts, he'll be arrested, tried, and imprisoned. Everything he owns will be seized to pay his debts, including you. The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret continued, her voice gaining intensity. But I can't expose him alone. I'm just a hysterical wife jealous of her husband's attentions. That's how they'll frame it. I need witnesses. I need evidence. I need his own words condemning him, spoken before people who matter, people who can't be dismissed. She leaned forward, her perfume, expensive French lavender, clashing with the rough surroundings. I need you to make him confess publicly. Make him so drunk on his feelings for you that he admits what he's done, announces his intentions before witnesses. Then I destroy him with the legal evidence. He goes to prison. His assets are liquidated. And in the chaos, Margaret's voice dropped to barely a whisper. You disappear. I'll make sure of it. Real freedom, not his poisoned version. North, where no one knows your face, with enough money to start over. All I ask is that you help me bury him first. Celeste stared at this woman who'd watched her suffer for years without intervention, who'd benefited from the system that enslaved her, who was now offering liberation not from kindness but from revenge. It was a devil's bargain, trading one form of manipulation for another. But it was also the only real chance at freedom she'd ever been offered. Why should I trust you? Celeste asked, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Margaret's laugh was sharp and brittle. You shouldn't. But tell me, girl, do you have any better options? The truth of those words cut deep. Celeste thought of Thomas's freedom papers that would make her his kept woman forever. Thought of the years stretching ahead, performing love she didn't feel. Thought of the iron collar of his devotion that was really just ownership in prettier language. Then she thought of something else. A plan within a plan. A third option neither Thomas nor Margaret had considered. What about the others? Celeste asked suddenly. The other people he owns? Margaret frowned, confused. What about them? If his assets are seized, they'll be sold to pay his debts. Separated. Families torn apart. Children sold away from mothers. Celeste's voice hardened. I won't save myself and leave them to that fate. For the first time, something like respect flickered in Margaret's eyes. You want them freed too? All of them, Celeste confirmed. Or no deal. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, calculating. Finally, she nodded slowly. There's a loophole. If Thomas is convicted of fraud, certain assets obtained through criminal means can be contested. With the right lawyer and the right judge, both of whom owe my family favors, we could argue that the slaves should be freed rather than sold, since they were purchased with stolen money. It's risky but possible. Celeste felt the stirrings of something she'd thought dead inside her. Hope. Real hope. Not the cruel fantasy Thomas offered, but a genuine chance at freedom for herself and the people who'd suffered alongside her. She extended her hand, a gesture of equals, not mistress and slave. Then we have an agreement. Margaret looked at the offered hand for a long moment, then shook it. Her grip was firm, cold, and carried the weight of mutual destruction. We destroy him together, Margaret said. 2 weeks. There's a business dinner with his partners from New Orleans. Make him drunk on wine and love. Make him confess everything. Can you do that? Celeste thought of the performance she'd given for 5 years. The exhausting theater of false affection. I can do it, she said quietly. Good. Margaret turned to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing, he hits me, you know. When we're alone and he's been drinking. Split my lip last month. Broke my wrist the year before. Everyone thinks we're the perfect plantation couple. But behind closed doors, he's a monster. She looked back at Celeste. And for the first time, the two women truly saw each other. Both victims of the same man's violence, separated by race and law, but united by suffering. I want you to know that, so you understand why I'm doing this. Then Margaret was gone, vanishing into the darkness like a specter, leaving Celeste alone with a dangerous alliance and an even more dangerous idea forming in her mind. As Celeste agreed to Margaret's plan, she made a silent promise to herself. She would be free, but not the way either Thomas or Margaret imagined. As Celeste agreed to Margaret's plan, she made a silent promise to herself. She would be free, but not the way either Thomas or Margaret imagined. The next 2 weeks moved like a dangerous dance where one wrong step meant death. Celeste played her role with new purpose, no longer just surviving Thomas's attention, but weaponizing it. She laughed more at his terrible jokes, let her hand linger on his arm during their evening conversations, gazed at him with manufactured adoration that made his chest swell with pride. Thomas, fool that he was, believed he'd finally broken through her reserve, that she was genuinely falling in love with him. He became reckless in his devotion, making decisions that would have seemed insane to any rational man. He began taking furniture from the main house, a mahogany writing desk, a silver tea service, an imported Persian rug, and moving it to a house he was having built on the Arkansas property. Margaret documented every theft with cold precision, noting dates and values in a leather journal she kept hidden in her wardrobe. But Thomas wasn't just stealing furniture. He was stealing money, lots of it, from the very men who trusted him. His business partners in New Orleans had invested heavily in a cotton venture, pooling their resources to buy additional land and equipment. Thomas was supposed to purchase 300 acres in Mississippi, but instead he'd bought the Arkansas property for Celeste and pocketed the difference. He'd falsified receipts, forged signatures, created an entire paper trail of lies to cover his theft. It was fraud on a massive scale, and he'd done it all for a woman who couldn't stand his touch. Meanwhile, the other slaves on the plantation watched these developments with growing anxiety. They saw Thomas's behavior becoming more erratic, saw how he neglected his duties to spend time with Celeste, saw how the overseer, a brutal man named Dawkins, was given free rein to work them harder to compensate for the master's distraction. The whispers in the quarters grew louder. Something bad was coming. They could feel it in their bones, and when masters fell, slaves paid the price. Celeste knew she had to bring them into her confidence. Late one night, she gathered 5 people she trusted absolutely. Big Moses, who worked the cotton press and had arms like tree trunks. Sarah, the cook who'd been on the plantation for 30 years and knew every secret. Young Isaiah, barely 16 but smart as a whip. Ruth, who tended the main house and saw everything. And old Marcus, who couldn't work the fields anymore but whose wisdom guided them all. In the shadows behind the quarters, she told them everything. Margaret's plan, the business dinner, the possibility of freedom for all of them. "It's risky," Big Moses rumbled, his voice deep as thunder. "White folks make promises to each other all the time and break them. What makes you think that woman will keep her word?" "I don't trust her," Celeste admitted. "But I have a plan of my own. When Thomas falls, when everything turns to chaos, that's when we run. All of us, north to the Free States. Margaret thinks I'll disappear alone, but I'm taking anyone who wants to come." Sarah shook her head, fear evident in her eyes. "Girl, they hunt down runaways like dogs. They got patrols, got bounty hunters, got laws that say they can drag us back from anywhere." "Not if there's no one left to hunt us," Celeste said quietly. "Not if the plantation itself burns." The silence that followed was profound. What she was suggesting wasn't just escape, it was destruction, erasure, the complete elimination of the system that held them captive. It was dangerous and desperate and possibly suicidal. "I'm in," Isaiah said suddenly, his young voice strong. "I ain't living like this no more. I'd rather die trying to be free than die in these fields." One by one, they agreed. They would wait for the night of the business dinner, wait for Thomas to incriminate himself, wait for the moment when the white folks were distracted by their own drama. Then they would take what they needed and burn the rest. While Celeste was building her secret coalition, Thomas was spiraling into increasingly reckless behavior. He stopped attending church, stopped meeting with his factors, stopped pretending to care about anything except Celeste. He began drinking heavily in the afternoons, and when drunk, he became cruel to the other slaves, striking a young boy for moving too slowly, having the overseer whip a field hand for singing, selling a woman's child away because her crying annoyed him. The plantation was becoming a powder keg, and Thomas was walking around with a lit match. Margaret watched all of this with grim satisfaction, adding each cruelty to her mental ledger of grievances. The business dinner was set for Saturday, May 15th. Margaret had invited Thomas's 3 partners from New Orleans, serious men with serious money, men who would not tolerate being defrauded. She'd planned an elaborate meal, hired musicians from Baton Rouge, transformed the plantation into a stage for Thomas's destruction. She instructed Celeste to wear her finest dress, to sit near enough that Thomas would be distracted by her presence, to keep his wine glass full, to encourage his boastfulness. Make him feel invincible, Margaret had whispered during one of their secret meetings. Powerful men confess everything when they think they're untouchable. The day of the dinner arrived hot and humid, the air thick with the threat of storms. Thomas spent the afternoon in his study, drinking bourbon and rehearsing what he would say. He'd decided, in his arrogance, to announce his intentions publicly, to tell his partners that he was freeing Celeste, that he was setting her up in Arkansas, that love transcended the boundaries of law and custom. He believed they would understand, that they would see him as enlightened rather than insane. He was wrong about everything. As the sun set and carriages arrived bearing the New Orleans men and their wives, the plantation transformed into something glittering and false. Candles blazing, crystal gleaming, slaves serving food they'd never taste while wearing their best livery. Thomas stood at the head of the table in his finest black suit, his face flushed with wine and anticipation. Celeste sat near the back of the room, positioned where Thomas could see her, but the guests would think her just another servant. Margaret sat at the opposite end of the table from her husband, her face a perfect mask of social grace, playing the role of dutiful wife one final time. The dinner progressed through courses: turtle soup, roasted duck, sweet potatoes, corn pudding, pecan pie. Thomas drank steadily, his voice growing louder, his gestures more expansive. His partners discussed cotton prices and railroad investments, unaware they were sitting at a table built on their stolen money. Finally, as coffee was being served, Thomas stood. His chair scraped loudly against the floor and the conversation died. "Gentlemen," he announced, swaying slightly, "and ladies, I have something important to share. Something that represents the future of our society." Margaret's hand tightened around her napkin. Celeste felt her heart begin to race. The trap was sprung, and there was no going back. Thomas gestured grandly toward Celeste. "This woman represents something rare and beautiful, proof that affection knows no boundaries, that the human heart cannot be constrained by unjust laws. I have decided to free her, to give her property and means to—" He never finished the sentence. As Thomas stood before 50 witnesses, about to announce his intentions, Celeste saw something that made her blood run cold. Margaret was holding a pistol. This wasn't about justice anymore. As Thomas stood before 50 witnesses, about to announce his intentions, Celeste saw something that made her blood run cold. Margaret was holding a pistol. This wasn't about justice anymore. The pistol appeared in Margaret's hand like a magic trick, small, silver, deadly, the kind of weapon ladies kept in their bedchambers for protection. But Margaret wasn't pointing it at an intruder. She was pointing it directly at her husband's chest, her hand steady as stone, her face transformed from social grace into something ancient and terrible. "You were going to give her everything," Margaret said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. "My inheritance, our future, the respect of every family in Louisiana, all of it thrown away for a slave girl who can barely stand to look at you." Thomas froze, the wine-drunk confidence draining from his face. "Margaret, put that down. You're hysterical. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she interrupted, standing now, the pistol never wavering. "I understand that you've stolen from these men, She gestured to the shocked partners. "Embezzled over $40,000 to fund your disgusting fantasy. I understand that you've beaten me, humiliated me, and replaced me with property you purchased for $800. The guests erupted into chaos. Women screaming, men shouting, chairs scraping as people tried to move away from the line of fire. Thomas's partners were on their feet, faces purple with rage as Margaret's words about embezzlement sank in. $40,000? One of them roared. "Whitmore, is this true?" But Celeste wasn't watching Thomas or Margaret anymore. She was watching the door, where the overseer Dawkins had appeared with 3 armed men, drawn by the commotion. She was watching Big Moses at the edge of the room, his massive hands clenched into fists. She was watching everything spiral beyond anyone's control, the careful plan dissolving into violence and madness. Thomas tried to rush at Margaret, but she pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in the enclosed dining room, but Margaret's hand shook at the last second. Whether from fear or hesitation, no one would ever know. The bullet meant for Thomas's chest hit Isaiah instead. The young man had been serving near the doorway, and the shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around in a spray of blood. He hit the floor hard, and something inside Celeste broke. Not broke, but burned away, leaving only cold clarity and survival instinct. This was no longer about revenge or justice. This was about living through the next 5 minutes. The chaos multiplied exponentially. Isaiah's scream triggered something primal in the other slaves present. Big Moses threw a heavy serving platter at Dawkins, catching the overseer across the face and sending him stumbling backward. Sarah grabbed a carving knife from the table. Ruth started pushing the white guests toward the door, years of subservience evaporating in an instant. The guests were trampling each other trying to escape, convinced they were witnessing a full slave uprising. In the confusion, Thomas lunged at Celeste, his face twisted with rage and betrayal. "You planned this," he snarled, his hands reaching for her throat. "You and her? You turned everyone against me, you ungrateful." She'd learned long ago where men were vulnerable. Her knee came up hard and fast, and Thomas doubled over with a howl of pain. Celeste ran, pushing through the chaos toward the back of the house where the other conspirators were waiting. Behind her, she heard another gunshot, Margaret firing wildly, trying to finish what she'd started. She heard glass shattering, heard the overseer shouting orders to his men, heard the guests screaming as they fled into the night. Then she smelled smoke. Someone had knocked over the candelabras in the panic, and the imported curtains Thomas had spent a fortune on were going up like kindling. Fire spread across the expensive wallpaper, hungry and fast, fed by the years of polish on the wooden floors. The mansion that had stood for 30 years was becoming an inferno in minutes. "Now!" Celeste screamed as she burst into the kitchen where the others waited. "Everyone now! Grab what we packed and run!" They'd prepared for this. Hidden sacks of food, stolen money, maps copied from Thomas's study showing routes north. Big Moses had already freed the horses from the stable. Sarah had the plantation's cash box she'd stolen from the office. Marcus was leading the younger children out through the kitchen garden. They moved like a coordinated unit, 23 souls making a break for freedom while the masters destroyed each other. Celeste paused at the edge of the property, looking back at the mansion now fully engulfed in flames. Through a window she could see figures still moving inside. Thomas trying to save his precious documents, Margaret standing frozen with the empty pistol, the guests who hadn't escaped yet screaming for help that wasn't coming. In the flames, Celeste faced a choice. Save the man who claimed to love her, save the woman who offered her freedom, or save herself. She chose herself. She chose the people running beside her through the darkness, chose the possibility of real freedom over the certainty of chains. Thomas and Margaret had used her as a weapon against each other, both believing she would serve their purposes. Neither understood that Celeste had always been fighting her own war. "Keep moving!" Big Moses called from ahead. We got maybe an hour before they organized search parties. Behind them, the Whitmore plantation burned like a funeral pyre, consuming everything. The big house with its crystal and silver, the account books full of lies, The bills of sale that claimed human beings were property, the whips and chains and carefully maintained illusions. The fire was democracy in its purest form, destroying master and mansion without discrimination. As they disappeared into the swamp, Celeste heard one final sound carrying across the night. A scream, whether Thomas's or Margaret's. She couldn't tell and didn't care. Some people had to burn before others could be warm. Some houses had to fall before new ones could be built. Some loves, if you could even call it love, had to die before real life could begin. In the flames, Celeste faced a choice. Save the man who claimed to love her, save the woman who offered her freedom, or save herself. They traveled north for 47 days, moving only at night, hiding in swamps and forests during daylight, following the North Star and the secret networks of people, both black and white, who believed slavery was an abomination. 3 of their group didn't make it. Old Marcus died of fever in a Mississippi hideout, passing peacefully in his sleep after seeing them safely beyond the worst of the pursuit. 2 others, frightened by the enormity of what they'd done, turned back in Tennessee, unable to bear the uncertainty of freedom. The rest pressed on. They learned later, from a sympathetic Quaker family in Kentucky, what had happened that night at the Whitmore plantation. The fire had killed 4 people. Thomas Whitmore, trapped in his study trying to save his account books, suffocated by smoke before the flames reached him. Margaret Whitmore, found in the foyer with the empty pistol still in her hand, overcome by smoke as she tried to escape through the front door she'd walked through as a bride 20 years earlier. The overseer Dawkins, crushed by a falling beam, and one of the business partners from New Orleans who'd gone back to help and never came out. The newspapers called it a tragic accident, blamed faulty candles and old curtains. The surviving partners, upon discovering the embezzlement after Thomas's death, chose to keep it quiet rather than admit they'd been defrauded. They sold the ruined plantation, divided the remaining assets, and never spoke of the Whitmores again. History, as it so often does, smoothed over the ugly truth and replaced it with a more palatable fiction. But the slaves who'd run weren't listed among the dead, and that mystery haunted the county for years. 23 people vanished that night, and despite bounty hunters and patrols and posted rewards, not one was ever recovered. It was as if they'd been consumed by the same fire that took their masters, turned to smoke and carried north on the wind. The truth was simultaneously simpler and more miraculous. By August of 1847, Celeste reached Philadelphia with 18 others, survivors, not victims. Free people, not property. The Quakers connected them with the growing free black community there, people who'd made similar journeys, who understood that freedom was just the first step in a much longer journey. Celeste found work as a seamstress, her careful hands, trained to arrange flowers in a dead man's study, now creating beautiful things she could actually keep. She lived in a small room above a bakery, slept in a bed she'd bought with money she'd earned, walked streets where no one could sell her, speak to her without permission, or touch her without consequence. It was the most ordinary life imaginable, and it was everything. But freedom came with its own weight. At night, Celeste still woke, gasping, feeling phantom hands around her throat. Hearing Thomas's voice calling her his beloved, she scrubbed her skin less often now. But the feeling of being owned, that fundamental violation of the self, didn't wash away easily. She saw Margaret's face sometimes, frozen in that moment before she pulled the trigger, and wondered if the woman had found her own kind of freedom in those final moments, breaking free from the performance of being a perfect plantation wife. Sarah opened a small restaurant that became a haven for newly arrived refugees from the South. Big Moses found work at the docks, his strength finally his own to sell or withhold as he chose. Young Isaiah, recovered from his bullet wound, learned to read and became a teacher, educating children born free and those who'd bought their freedom with blood and courage. They built new lives from the ashes of the old ones, and if they were haunted, well, freedom had never promised to be easy, only to be theirs. 5 years after that terrible night, Celeste sat in a Philadelphia courthouse and testified in a case against a slave catcher who'd tried to kidnap a free woman. Her testimony, clear and compelling, helped convict the man. Afterward, the judge, an older gentleman with kind eyes, asked her where she'd learned to speak so precisely, to remember details so accurately. She almost told him about the years of performing for Thomas, the exhausting theater of survival that had taught her to read people, to remember everything, to calculate the consequences of every word. Instead, she smiled and said simply, "I learned from watching people who thought I wasn't watching back." The judge nodded, understanding more than she'd said. Before she left the courthouse, he handed her a document. It was a news clipping from Louisiana, yellowed with age, reporting the fire at the Whitmore plantation. Celeste read it standing in the autumn sunlight, this official version of her story that erased her completely, that turned her liberation into an accident, that granted Thomas and Margaret a dignity in death they'd never shown in life. At the yacht bottom in the judge's careful handwriting was a single sentence. "History is written by those who survive to tell it. Tell yours truly." And slowly, carefully, Celeste began to understand the final twist in her story. The one neither Thomas nor Margaret had known, the secret she'd carried since that first night in her cabin when Margaret proposed their devil's bargain. The letter Margaret had clutched in Section 1, the letter she believed would change everything. Margaret had thought it was her letter to the lawyer, her evidence of Thomas's crimes. But Celeste had switched them. The real letter Margaret held was one Celeste had written months earlier to a freed man in Philadelphia, a letter asking about escape routes, about the underground network, about whether freedom was truly possible. Celeste had planted it where Margaret would find it, knowing it would push the woman toward action, knowing it would accelerate the timeline, knowing that sometimes you had to let people think they were using you while you used them right back. Margaret had thought she was manipulating Celeste into destroying Thomas. Thomas had thought he was saving Celeste with his twisted version of love. Neither understood that Celeste had been writing her own story all along, using their hatred of each other as the fuel for her escape, letting them destroy each other while she slipped away into a freedom they could never have imagined. History recorded the fire as an accident. The town mourned a respected landowner and his troubled wife. But in the ashes of that plantation, something else burned. The lie that a master could ever truly love someone he owned. Celeste understood what Thomas never could. Love requires freedom, and freedom requires sacrifice. Sometimes you had to let the old world burn completely before you could build a new one. She folded the newspaper clipping carefully and placed it in a box with Thomas's unwanted gifts, with Margaret's stolen documents, with all the artifacts of her captivity. Then she walked out into the Philadelphia afternoon, into a life that belonged entirely to herself, surrounded by people who'd made the same impossible journey, who'd paid the same terrible price, and who understood that freedom, real freedom, was worth everything it cost. History recorded the fire as an accident. The town mourned a respected landowner and his troubled wife. But in the ashes of that plantation, something else burned. The lie that a master could ever truly love someone he owned. Celeste understood what Thomas never could. Love requires freedom. And freedom requires sacrifice. This story reminds us that behind every forbidden romance in history, there was often a hidden truth. Power isn't love. Control isn't affection. And sometimes the only way to be free is to burn it all down. If this story made you think differently about history, hit that subscribe button. Because the stories they didn't teach you in school, those are the ones that matter most. Drop a comment telling me, what would you have done in Celeste's position? And remember, the bravest thing she did wasn't escaping. It was refusing to let anyone else write her ending.